Welcome back. This is the part two of the lecture on the Reformation. And we begin here where I left off in the previous lecture, which is now posted, um, with the third slide, I believe it is. Yes, the third slide on the PowerPoint, the printing revolution. One of the major factors involved in the impact of the Reformation and to understand its spread and development, it was the rise of printing. The Reformation has been called the first mass media movement. Printing had been established before the Reformation in the mid 15th century. You probably have heard of Johannes Gutenberg, the Gutenberg Bible. Um, Gutenberg, though, was not the first to print. There was printing before Gutenberg. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the way it was done was called block printing. Block printing was to take a page of manuscript. You have a wooden block. You carved the whole page on that wooden block. Then you would ink it and print it and go from there. What Gutenberg did was to develop movable type. So rather than making a whole page a block, because once that's done, you can't reuse that block except to print more copies of that single page, individual letters and characters. And then it was called composition. It was a form that they would then, someone called the compositor, would put the letters on the page in accordance with the manuscript, ink that and print it, and then reuse those same letters. And so all of a sudden it made printing more efficient, more cost effective, and more popular. Earlier on, these early prints, both block prints, there are very few block prints in existence, but we do have some. But beginning with Gutenberg, we have a slow increase in printing. Manuscripts are still being produced, written by hand. It's a new technology. New technology takes a while to catch on, so to speak. I think I may have mentioned, maybe not, maybe this was in another class, that I first started graduate school using a typewriter, and I was resistant to using a computer. And it took me a while before I saw the benefits and before I became adapted to it. So there's this transition period. Same thing with printing. Manuscripts had been around, writing out books by hand, and before the books of scrolls back in antiquity, was common practice. People knew how to do it. It was comfortable. It was accepted. It was laborious. But this new technology seemed to be even more laborious. So the early prints, up until the Reformation, early 16th century, we find in terms of if we chart the number of prints, they go up and up and up and up and up. But then with Luther, all of a sudden it's like whoop. And with that takeoff of printing, Luther and Luther's works dominated overwhelmingly. So all of a sudden, we have this new spread of information. Now, literacy rates in Europe were still rather low. Um, they were beginning to increase, but they were still relatively low. We have not simply the nobility, but anybody who would be educated could read. The artisan class, the merchant class, increasingly could read. The peasants, even though I talked about the legal definition thereof, but the agricultural workers, the general population, still could not read. But you have then circles where things would be read to people. So let's say you're in a smallish town, and often someone called the Staatsschreiber, the secretary for the town, for the city, who would be responsible for writing the documents of the city to their overlord or whatever, making proclamations for the city, all those types of things, could read and write in Latin. Also, of course, in vernacular, whether it be French or early English or German. And those people were educated at a lower level, not necessarily a university level, and they would meet in the pubs and say, "Hey, here's the latest thing. Let me read you this." Blah 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 blah. And on we go. But with the Reformation, it really took off. Not only the printing of books, but especially the printing of something called pamphlets. Pamphlets, by definition, were cheap, mass produced, intended to reach a large audience. In German, they were called Flugschriften, which basically means flying writing. That gives an idea, but in English, we call them pamphlets. They were anywhere between one page or two, no, excuse me, 2 pages, because one page is a broadsheet, which is technically different. But from 2 pages to 200 pages. So you could actually have full on books that were classified as Flugschriften or pamphlets. Um, most pamphlets were probably from 5 to 20 pages or so. And they became the mass media of the time. So you have this widespread information, and it is being dominated by Luther. Just think today, if a single individual could not monopolize but dominate the media, how that would affect the spread of ideas and the climate of opinion. All of a sudden, complaints and issues are being put forward and being spread out there. We're not alone. There's a lot of people that believe like we believe, think like we believe. Yeah, we have to do something about it. And they also served as propaganda. Now, propaganda is something that we often associate with the Nazis, and we'll be talking about that as well. But the term propaganda comes from the Latin propagandum, which means to be spread, to be made known. If you can affect not only the information that is spread, but also how it's spread, that's propaganda. It's simply putting forward a point of view. We live in a world of propaganda today. Everything from advertising to the politics, and scarcely, I think, need to point that out, where people are trying to influence what we think and what we believe. Now, in the Nazi period, we'll get to eventually in this course, Friedrich Goebbels was the minister for propaganda for Hitler, as well as other things. And Goebbels said, how do you affect public opinion with propaganda? You keep the message short, you make it memorable, and you repeat it over and over and over and over and over and over again. And eventually it seeps in. Today we're in the phase of fake news, conspiracy theories, and everything else. But that's part of one of the ways it spreads. It keeps being repeated. It's memorable. It ties in with something, and so all of a sudden people say, yeah, the election was stolen. Stop the steal. Of course, I believe that, and I see it all over the place. Just as one example. But it starts really here with the print culture and the rise of print culture and its spread in the 16th century with the Reformation, especially with Luther. And also with Luther, he included images. Pictures went with words. One of the slogans in terms of Luther is sola scriptura, by scripture alone. There's often 3 different solas: sola fide, sola gratia, and sola scriptura, as encapsulating Luther and the Reformation. All of those are wrong, actually. Not that Luther didn't advocate for sola fide, by faith alone, justification by faith alone, or that salvation is by grace alone, or that there should be just scripture alone. But what do they mean? First of all those terms were medieval terms, basically. Sola fide can be found in the Middle Ages. The justification is sola fide, by faith alone. The issue there is what is meant by faith. And often it was the faith of the church. But if you don't adhere to the faith that is proclaimed in the articles of faith and the teachings of the church, you can't be saved. Whereas with Luther, it's more of a personal faith, what you believe. Justification, the same thing. It's not just justification as opposed to works, but there are people who would say you need both. But faith is predominant, and especially with the Augustinians, faith is the overwhelming majority. It's only based on faith that then you can do good works, which is very similar to Luther's position as he developed it later on. And then sola scriptura meant that theological debate and argument had to be based on Scripture. That's where the authority came from. Now, there were issues in the Middle Ages in terms of Scripture and tradition. But what is the tradition? The tradition is the theological tradition of how Scripture was interpreted in the past. So it's saying, that gets back to what I said in the last lecture, the part one of this lecture with Charles V at the Diet of Worms, saying, how can 1,000 years of tradition be wrong and you alone right? Because it was Scripture alone. It's certainly not like his opponents did not use Scripture. They did. They argued against him thoroughly using Scripture. And Luther simply said, you don't know what you're talking about. Very convenient when Luther is setting himself up as the person who interprets Scripture. Because that is the problem with Scripture, with any text, is what does it mean and how should it be interpreted? It's an issue of authority. And Luther just didn't believe the other interpretations. He said, I'm right, you're wrong, which is not necessarily Scripture alone, especially when he starts printing his own works, or people start printing his own works and start using imagery, woodcuts, to explain what the text is meaning in some very skewed ways. For example, with his translation of the Bible, which he did, began at least with the New Testament, while he's in the Wartburg, being protected by Frederick the Wise. When it was published, the September Testament, in 1522, 1523, it came out with, number one, glosses and with pictures. Now, what's a gloss? The medieval Bible, by and large, there are exceptions, by and large, when it was copied or then printed, was printed with glosses, what scholars have said, the church fathers, sometimes other scholars. And so a page of the Bible, you'd have the text of the Bible, and then all around it, you'd have commentary or other interpretations. Now, Luther said we have to get rid of all the glosses, which he did, but then added back his own. And so not nearly as extensive as a late 15th century Bible would be, the glosses all over. But still, he is saying this is how this passage should be understood. This is what this means. And then later on, the printings of his Bible came with pictures, including in Revelation, with the Whore of Babylon coming riding in, with the papal tiara. I mean, the whole thing in terms of images. And often when I deal with this in person, I show images from Luther's works and others that were meant to get the message across. Not just in writing, not just in rational discourse, but in meaning and in imagery. Very much like advertising today. There are pictures that went along with Luther's, of the devil chewing up popes and everything else, and I could go into a lot of detail there. But it was a way of showing how Scripture should be understood. So it's not simply Scripture alone, it is Scripture based on a particular view and interpretation. The same thing with woodcuts and Luther's works, propaganda that was sent out to affect popular opinion, mass opinion in general. So when we have these, we can see a new technology being used for political purposes, for religio-theological purposes, all kind of together. And a great example of this is a pamphlet put out by Philip Melanchthon, who was Luther's right-hand man in Wittenberg in 1521, called The Passion of Christ and Antichrist. And the issue of the Passion of Christ had been a late medieval development in piety, meditating on the Passion. And Melanchthon drew on that and then made it opposed to the papacy. So he would show Christ chasing out the money changers in the temple. And on the opposite picture was the Pope collecting money from indulgences of the Antichrist. And so it's that type of approach that was designed to get the message out graphically with imagery as well as with text. So when we say sola scriptura, we have to understand what that's getting at. It's based on Luther's interpretation. It's based on imagery. It's based on trying to affect public opinion, as we'll see shortly too. Even other, I want to use the term here, though they'll have to come back to, quote unquote, Protestants. We'll get back to Protestants. But let's say people who were opposed to Rome in the wake of Luther disagreed with Luther very strongly in terms of the interpretation of Scripture. What did Luther say? You're wrong. This idea that with Luther, everybody could read the Bible and come up with their own interpretation is absolutely false. For Luther, it was, this is the way it is. This is what it means. And if you don't agree with me, you are damned. He even viewed his opponents, his Protestant opponents, as worse than the Pope and the papacy and the Catholics, because they know the truth, but then they're skewing it and messing it up. It was really a crisis of authority. Where does authority lie? If there's a dispute, who determines it? If rational argument can't win the day, that was one of the things in medieval Christendom. The Pope was the final judge. Go back to Harry Truman, saying the buck stops here as president. Okay, we can debate about what's the best way to do it and everything, but I'm the one in charge. I'm the one that's going to make the final decision. That was the position of the papacy in medieval Christendom. Now, it didn't always work out that way, as I think I've indicated. Emperors and kings would think they were in charge, but that was at least a theoretical structure regarding the Scripture, that the Pope was the final judge. Luther now is saying, no, the Pope's not the final judge. Scripture is the final judge. But who interprets Scripture? Luther has been called the Pope of Wittenberg from the 16th century on, and there's good reason. Why? Because his view, even if it was not explicated rationally, in that I am the authority to determine what Scripture means, was that if you didn't agree with his interpretation, he just dismissed you as wrong and being diabolical or insidious or some other issue. So that's what we have to realize, that these slogans had meaning and context, and we can't take them as representing something that is there. No way did Luther say every individual could read the Bible and get what they meant out of it and know what was going on. But the information was being distributed. It was getting out there. Problem is, what did it mean and how do we interpret it? And that is where all the conflict came from. And that is also what led to various patterns and manifestations of now the situation is German princes with Frederick the Wise protecting Luther are standing up against the emperor and standing up against the Pope and seemingly winning. Luther went back from the Wartburg to Wittenberg in 1522. Because while Luther was gone, eventually they found out what had happened to him. He communicated with them. Other scholars in Wittenberg started saying, we have to go further. Yes, we have to reform things further. Luther is kind of going too slowly. And one person there was a man by the name of Andrew Karlstadt. And Karlstadt was an older scholar. He actually presided over Luther's doctorate. And he disagreed with Luther early on, but then he had a conversion experience and saw that Luther was right, and even more so, went even more radically. So he started saying at Wittenberg, he kind of led the movement. Luther's right-hand man, Philip Melanchthon, was still very young scholar, and didn't really know what to do about it all. But Karlstadt took the lead while Luther was in the Wartburg and started instituting all kinds of changes, started saying we should break images, get rid of all the images in the church, all these popish superstitions of this statues of the saints and everything else, an iconoclastic view. He was also the one that say, and the Mass, we should have communion for everybody in both kinds, and just not worry about it. It's not so much that it is actually physically the body of and blood of Christ; it just represents it, or so. And I won't go into the intricacies of Karlstadt's Eucharistic theology. It was idiosyncratic, to say the least, because the words of institution of the Last Supper, Karlstadt interpreted that as Christ pointing to his own body, not to the elements at all. But that's in some ways another issue. And Luther finally said, I don't care what the danger is, I have to go back to Wittenberg to put a stop to this radicalism that's going on, which he does, preaches a series of 8 sermons called the Invocavit sermons. Karlstadt is shamed and ends up leaving Wittenberg and starts a movement that is ended up calling the Radical Reformation. Now, if you look at the slides, I have, not in the 4th slide where I am now, the German Peasants' War, but in the 5th slide, Patterns of Reformation, I have the Radical Reformation, which I'll come back to. But it begins this concept of radical change. Begins kind of with Karlstadt when Luther's not in Wittenberg, and this idea that the lid has been blown off. So let's just go for it all the way. And one of that manifestations came and harmonized and fused with peasant unrest that had been there throughout the late Middle Ages, throughout Europe, and also in Germany. There had been peasant uprisings in the early 16th century called the Bundschuh, where peasants were saying, we need our rights. And which brings me then to the German Peasants' War of 1525, which is in slide 4. Now, in some ways, it's been fun to point out that the German Peasants' War of 1525 was a war not simply of Germans, not simply peasants. It was not really a war, and it wasn't just in 1525. It was a series of uprisings, primarily in Lower Germany and Austria, and it did tap into peasant unrest, this unrest that had been ongoing. Part of your readings for this week are these 12 articles of the peasants. So you can see what they're dealing with. What they're dealing with are grievances against the nobility. Now, I need to put this in somewhat a context because it's so easy to see this as they're tired of being peasants and oppressed and they want their freedom. That's not what was going on whatsoever. And if you read the articles carefully in the context which I'm presenting to you, I think you'll see that. In the later Middle Ages, there began to be a crisis of the lower nobility financially. They were being pressed and under financial hardship. So what do? What does any company do? They pass along the extra costs to the people below them, namely the peasants. So what they were doing, things like fishing in the rivers, hunting in the forests, taxes. They started raising taxes. They started charging for a lot of these things that had been free and open, and they started to infringe upon the traditional rights of peasants. What we find throughout the later medieval period on into the Reformation or the 16th century period up into the German Peasants' War is not an issue of we don't want to be peasants anymore. It's simply we're happy to be peasants. Give us our traditional rights as peasants. Make it so that we can actually live. We'll happily work for you. That's not the problem. The problem is allow us our traditional privileges as peasants. All these grievances leading up to this major outbreak. And what this major outbreak was is a series of revolts beginning in 1524, continuing into the end of 25, or even a little bit into 1526, were stimulated too by the artisan class and some of these lower level merchants, not the very wealthy merchants, certainly not the bankers, but these lower level artisans who were also educated, fused together with the peasant unrest to articulate their grievances. This has been called the gospel of social unrest. And they're appealing now to Luther and this new movement, which was originally called the evangelical movement. Evangelium is Latin for the gospels, the good news. And Luther and his movement originally were called the evangelicals. not the Protestants. They were not Protestants yet. I'll be getting to that shortly. But the evangelicals. And all of a sudden, some of these city administrators who were closer to the peasants in class than they were to the very wealthy started writing grievances, started writing complaints, and presenting them to cities, to the princes, and so we want these things. There are a number of different articles justifying this rebellion, and the 12 articles are or were probably the most widespread and best known at the time to articulate the grievances the peasants had. Tolls, death taxes, those are the types of issues that are involved, as well as the right to choose their own pastors. We don't want to have to just be imposed with somebody. The whole fact, and you can read them. That's why they're there. I want you to read them to see what was going on. But there's nowhere that, unless you can argue to me that there is, where they're saying we're tired of being peasants. We are equal to you. This was not even at the same level as the French Revolution when we get there, overthrowing the establishment. They weren't necessarily looking to overthrow the social structures. They were looking to be afforded their traditional rights that allowed them to be what they were as peasants and working for their lords, whether it's a city or a feudal lord overall. Now, this led to armed. It led to to armed conflict that we're going to take to the streets. And so there's a lot of pictures depicting these things from the time in various woodcuts, again, artistic depictions of peasants fighting with pitchforks and everything else. This was seen as, by the lords, as reprehensible. Luther stood firmly against the peasants. Now, he had written a treatise called The Freedom of the Christian. And this was taken, in his view, out of context by these peasant groups and their artisan level leaders or spokespersons as meaning something that it wasn't. Luther had said that a Christian is the perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none, and that a Christian is the perfectly dutiful servant, subject to all. This was a paradox, but Luther meant it in terms of a theological position, not a social position. And what was going on with the peasant uprising, this German war, is that some of those people were saying, hey, you said that we should be free. I had said that they weren't arguing to be free as such, and they weren't, but they appealed to the gospel as the basis for their traditional rights over against the nobility. And Luther sided with the nobility. He wrote a pamphlet against the murdering, ravenous hordes of peasants, exhorting the princes to kill, stab, slay the murdering, rebellious hordes of peasants. You will merit your salvation, Luther wrote, by the amount of peasant blood you spill. Unmercifully kill them and put it down. There's nothing worse than a rebellious peasant in Luther's eyes. So much for individualism, so much for toleration, so much for freedom, so much for quote-unquote modernity, as seen in Martin Luther. He saw this because this undermined the very structures and fabrics of society. That was not what Luther was willing to do. He was very much a traditionalist, a conservative in terms of political social structure. And yet, still adhered to opposition against whether it be the emperor or the papacy. So things are beginning to change in this context, but it's not in this sense that we would say, we know what that's like. Very different mindset. So read the articles, see what you can see in there to then be able to talk about what was going on in terms of this more radicalized movement, social movement, to the point where this was condemned by all the princes. Yeah, peasants were repressed. But it started and was part of, again, I talked about the pot being, the lid being blown off the pot. And after Luther, we see a number of other rebellions, not just the peasant uprisings in the so-called German Peasants' War, but other theological movements in other places that also then started standing up against Rome, breaking from Rome to say, you are not going to determine our doctrine, our principles, and our allegiance. I have up here 3 different patterns of Reformation, because all of these different movements can be seen as different patterns of Reformation. One of the earliest ones, aside from the Radical Reformation, is called the City Reformation. I will deal with that when I get to Calvin and Calvinism, the Reformation of the Refugees, which I should have maybe put first, but it gets kind of messed up. So there's not necessarily a smooth chronological progression. Radical Reformation. I started with Karlstadt and just mentioned that Karlstadt